A threshold has been crossed in Washington that few believed would ever be reached. Just days after what appeared to be a reconciliatory meeting between the Trump administration and Chinese officials, a gathering designed to ease mounting economic tensions, the United States government dropped a bombshell. A tariff rate of 145% has been imposed on Chinese imports, a move so aggressive it sent tremors through financial markets on every continent. This isn't just another policy adjustment. This is economic warfare at a scale not witnessed in decades. But here's what makes this moment truly remarkable. Beneath the aggressive posturing, there are unmistakable signs of vulnerability coming from the American side. Supply networks that once flowed smoothly are now fragmenting. Strategic partners who typically stand shoulder to shoulder with Washington are now hesitating, questioning whether this path serves their own national interests. And perhaps most telling of all, sources within the administration are quietly discussing the possibility of tariffs climbing as high as 500% if Beijing refuses to capitulate. Meanwhile, China's response has been measured, almost eerily quiet. But that silence should not be mistaken for weakness or capitulation. Behind closed doors in Beijing, officials are preparing a counterstrike that doesn't rely on matching America's tariff rates dollar for dollar. Instead, they're mobilizing control over something far more potent, rare earth elements. These obscure metals with names most people have never heard of, neodymium, dysprosium, yttrium, form the invisible skeleton of our technological civilization. They're embedded in the smartphones we carry, the electric cars we drive, the wind turbines generating clean energy, and critically, the advanced weaponry that modern militaries depend upon. China doesn't just mine these materials. It dominates their production and processing at a level that gives it leverage no other resource-exporting nation currently possesses. At the same moment this geopolitical chess match intensifies, Scott Bessent, serving as Trump's Treasury Secretary, is traveling the world attempting to forge an international coalition against Beijing. His mission? To unite America's traditional allies, Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, into a unified economic front. But there's a fundamental problem with this strategy. Nearly all of these countries have economies deeply intertwined with China. Their industries consume Chinese components, their consumers buy Chinese products, and their manufacturers rely on Chinese raw materials. And as this storm gathers strength, a telling indicator has emerged from global financial markets. Investors, from institutional fund managers to ordinary citizens, are fleeing toward the oldest form of economic security humanity has ever known. Gold prices have rocketed past $4,200 per ounce, reaching heights that seemed unthinkable just months ago. What we're witnessing right now may be more than a trade dispute. This could be the beginning of a fundamental restructuring of global economic power itself. The announcement of a 145% tariff on Chinese goods didn't emerge from lengthy congressional debates or careful legislative processes. It came through an executive order, signed in the middle of the night, bypassing the traditional checks and balances of American governance. The official justification from the White House centered on protecting American manufacturing and jobs. The rhetoric emphasized national security, fair trade, and bringing production back to American soil. But when you examine the actual data, a more complicated picture emerges. Last year alone, the United States imported more than $427 billion worth of goods from China. This isn't just cheap toys or textiles. We're talking about advanced semiconductors that power our computers, lithium batteries that store renewable energy, medical devices that save lives in hospitals, and countless components that American manufacturers assemble into finished products. Now, virtually all of these imports face a pricing barrier so steep it fundamentally changes their economic viability. The market response was immediate and brutal. International shipping companies put container movements on hold, unsure how to price routes or manage logistics when tariff rates can shift overnight. Manufacturing facilities across California, Texas, and other industrial states began sending urgent messages to corporate headquarters, warning that their cost structures had just been demolished. Major retail chains, including giants like Walmart and Home Depot, started adjusting their pricing systems upward, preparing to pass these costs directly to consumers. Analysts at Goldman Sachs ran the numbers and delivered a sobering projection. These tariffs could inject an additional 0.6 of a percentage point into America's inflation rate within just a few months. That might not sound dramatic, but in an economy already battling price pressures, it represents a significant blow to household purchasing power. And here's the critical detail. Consumers will feel this pain long before any domestic manufacturing capacity can be built to replace Chinese suppliers. The ripple effects extend far beyond America's borders. Consider the position of European manufacturers. Many of their products incorporate Chinese components that get routed through American supply chains or distributors. When those components suddenly become 45% more expensive, European companies face an impossible choice: absorb crushing losses or raise their own prices and lose market share. Japan, South Korea, and other Asian economies face similar dilemmas. Their entire manufacturing ecosystems have evolved over decades to integrate Chinese inputs at various stages of production. In Beijing, the initial shock of the announcement quickly transformed into strategic calculation. China's Ministry of Commerce issued a formal statement condemning the tariffs as economic sabotage and a violation of international trade norms. The language was sharp, the tone indignant. But behind those public statements, a different conversation was taking place in government offices and industrial planning committees. Chinese officials weren't preparing to simply mirror America's tariff strategy. That would be predictable and ultimately ineffective against an economy as large as the United States. Instead, attention turned to rare earth elements, a sector where China possesses advantages so overwhelming that no amount of American policy maneuvering can quickly overcome them. The numbers are staggering. China controls approximately half of the world's known rare earth reserves buried in the ground. But the real strategic choke point isn't mining, it's refining. China has built up processing capacity that handles roughly 90% of global rare earth refining. This means that even rare earths mined in other countries often get shipped to Chinese facilities for processing before being turned into usable materials. Washington has talked extensively about rebuilding domestic rare earth capacity. Politicians give speeches about strategic independence. Defense analysts write reports about vulnerability. But the uncomfortable truth is this: establishing a complete rare earth supply chain from mining to refining to manufacturing requires more than political will. Industry experts estimate it would demand at least a decade of sustained effort and investments, potentially reaching into the trillions of dollars. And that's assuming everything goes smoothly, with no environmental challenges, permitting delays, or technological setbacks. So here's the paradox at the heart of America's aggressive tariff strategy. The tariffs were designed to punish China and force concessions. But they may actually end up strangling America's own high-tech industries, which desperately need rare earth elements to manufacture everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to defense systems. What began as a demonstration of American strength is rapidly transforming into a race against time, with Beijing quietly preparing to weaponize its control over the very materials that make modern civilization possible. When Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked directly about America's response options during a recent press conference, his answer was revealing in what it didn't say. "What is a fulsome response?" he was asked. "What does that mean?" His reply was vague, almost deliberately evasive. "We have lots of levers that we can pull for products that they need." That uncertainty, that lack of specificity, confirmed what markets had already begun to suspect. Washington's options are actually quite limited, while Beijing's leverage runs extraordinarily deep. And that leverage stems from a single resource category that most people have never thought about: rare earth elements. These are 17 metallic elements, with names like lanthanum, cerium, praseodymium, neodymium, that sound obscure and technical. Most people couldn't identify them on a periodic table, but they are absolutely essential to virtually every piece of modern technology. Electric vehicles need neodymium for their powerful motors. Wind turbines require dysprosium to function in extreme temperatures. Smartphones contain multiple rare earths in their screens, speakers, and vibration systems. Advanced military equipment, from guided missiles to fighter jet components, depends on these materials for their precision and performance. Remove rare earth elements from the global economy, and our high-tech world simply stops functioning. China's dominance in this sector is unlike anything we've seen with other natural resources. Even Saudi Arabia's historical control over oil production doesn't compare to China's grip on rare earths. China possesses somewhere between 38% and 40% of known global reserves still in the ground. That's substantial, but not overwhelming on its own. The real power comes from processing infrastructure. China refines nearly 90% of the world's rare earth supply. No other nation even approaches this capacity. The United States, despite being a technological superpower, processes almost none. Europe's processing capacity is minimal. Even countries with significant rare earth deposits, like Australia, typically ship their raw materials to China for refining. This dominance didn't materialize overnight or by accident. For decades, while Western countries were shutting down rare earth operations due to environmental concerns and economic unprofitability, China was making massive strategic investments. Billions of dollars poured into mining operations, refining facilities, and recycling technologies. The work was often dirty, sometimes dangerous, and initially not particularly profitable. But Chinese planners were thinking decades ahead, building infrastructure that would eventually give Beijing extraordinary leverage over the global economy. Today, that patient investment strategy has paid off in ways that are reshaping international power dynamics. According to research compiled by the European Commission, Germany, Europe's industrial powerhouse, depends on China for 91% of its refined rare earth supply. The United Kingdom relies on China for 89%. South Korea, despite its advanced technological sector, sources roughly 80% from Chinese suppliers. Even Japan, which has tried harder than most to diversify, still depends on China for approximately 58% of its rare earth needs. The United States, despite years of policy discussions about reducing dependence on China, still imports over 70% of its rare earth supply, either directly from China or indirectly through intermediary countries that source from Chinese refiners. And here's where the strategic picture becomes even more complex. The remaining significant rare earth deposits around the world, the reserves not currently controlled by China, are largely located in countries that have aligned themselves with Beijing through frameworks like BRICS. Brazil holds substantial deposits. India has significant reserves. Russia's rare earth resources are extensive. Together, these nations control nearly every major untapped rare earth deposit on the planet. If they were to coordinate their export policies with China, they could reshape global trade patterns within weeks. Here's what makes this leverage so powerful. China doesn't need to impose dramatic export bans to cause chaos in global markets. The threat alone is destabilizing. Even subtle actions, introducing new licensing requirements, slightly slowing approval processes, implementing modest export quotas, can send prices skyrocketing and create panic among manufacturers worldwide. We've seen this movie before. In 2010, during a diplomatic dispute with Japan, Beijing briefly tightened its rare earth export controls. The result was immediate and severe. Global prices for certain rare earth elements jumped by 700% within months. Industries that depended on these materials faced existential threats. The message to the world was clear. China's rare earth dominance translates into real economic power. Current analysts are now warning of an even more sophisticated form of leverage. According to trade law experts, if even a tiny fraction, as little as 0.1% of Chinese rare earths appear in any exported product, Beijing can claim legal and strategic influence over that entire trade relationship. Think about what that means in practical terms. A German car manufacturer builds electric vehicles using motors that contain neodymium refined in China. Even if every other component is European-made, that small rare earth content gives Beijing a potential veto over those exports. With global supply chains already stretched thin from pandemic disruptions and now facing new tariff pressures, this quiet battle over rare earth elements is emerging as the real front line of the global economic war. It's not dramatic. There are no tanks or missiles. But the strategic implications may be even more profound than conventional military conflicts. Scott Bessent, who is Trump's Treasury Secretary, is now, attempting to transform this bilateral trade confrontation into a global campaign against Chinese economic influence. His vision, honestly, is ambitious: to forge an international alliance capable of isolating Beijing economically. The idea is to bring together the European Union, Australia, Canada, Japan, and India under a unified strategic framework. The goal? Present China with a united front that cannot be divided or manipulated. On paper, during summit meetings and press conferences, it sounds like a plausible strategy. The rhetoric emphasizes shared values, common interests, and collective security. But the reality on the ground, it tells a very different story. Every single country that Bessent is trying to recruit into this coalition has an economy that depends fundamentally on Chinese goods, components, or raw materials. Asking them to cut ties with China isn't just about diplomatic solidarity. It's asking them to inflict serious economic harm on their own citizens and industries. Listen to Bessent's own words during a recent address. As the president has said, we want to help China, not hurt it. If some in the Chinese government want to slow down the global economy through disappointing actions and through economic coercion, the Chinese economy will be hurt the most. He continued. Make no mistake, this is China versus the world. They have put these unacceptable export controls on the entire world. China is a command and control economy, and we and our allies will neither be commanded nor controlled. The language is tough. The framing definitely adversarial. But beneath the rhetoric lies a fundamental vulnerability. The numbers make the challenge, crystal clear. China serves as the largest trading partner for more than 120 nations worldwide. That's not a peripheral economic relationship. It's central to how the global economy functions. China accounts for approximately 15% of all global exports, making it indispensable to international trade flows. Europe alone imports nearly $600 billion worth of Chinese products every single year. These aren't luxury goods that can be easily foregone. We're talking about industrial components, consumer electronics, pharmaceutical ingredients, and manufacturing inputs that European factories need to operate. Japan and South Korea, despite their close security relationships with the United States, rely on China for more than 1/3 of their critical mineral supplies and electronics components. Their manufacturing sectors would face immediate crisis if that flow was disrupted. Even India, which Washington often portrays as a natural counterweight to China, sources nearly 30% of its imported machinery and active pharmaceutical ingredients from Chinese suppliers. India's pharmaceutical industry, which produces generic drugs for the entire world, depends heavily on chemical precursors manufactured in China. So when Bessent asks these countries to join the coalition against China, he's essentially asking them to choose between American diplomatic approval and their own economic survival. Bessent understands this dilemma, which is why his actual approach is more subtle than his public rhetoric suggests. Rather than demanding immediate compliance, he's offering what he calls flexible partnerships. This means extending tariff implementation deadlines for cooperative countries, providing exemptions for certain product categories, and creating carve-outs that allow allies to maintain critical trade relationships with China while appearing to support American policy. It's diplomatic maneuvering designed to buy time and create the appearance of unity without, forcing anyone to make impossible choices. But allies are increasingly skeptical. European leaders, still dealing with energy price shocks from the Ukraine conflict, are terrified of another wave of inflation if Chinese goods suddenly become much more expensive. They remember how quickly public sentiment can turn when household budgets are squeezed. Australia faces its own calculations. More than 30% of Australian exports, mostly raw materials like iron ore and coal, flow to China. The Australian economy grew comfortable with Chinese demand over the past 2 decades. Walking away from that market would require painful economic restructuring. Behind the carefully staged photo opportunities at international summits, frustration is building on both sides. Washington wants loyalty and coordinated action. Its partners need economic stability and can't afford to jeopardize relationships that keep their industries functioning. Every diplomatic meeting ends with the same fundamental tension unresolved. Should these countries follow America's lead on principle, or should they protect the domestic industries and jobs that depend on connections to Beijing? While Bessent travels the world trying to hold this fragile coalition together, China is pursuing a very different strategy. Rather than trying to split apart existing alliances, Beijing is simply deepening its own networks. Trade with BRICS nations is expanding. Economic partnerships with countries across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia are strengthening. What started as a tariff battle between two countries is transforming into something much larger. A global contest for economic alignment and influence, where the question isn't just about trade flows, but about which economic system will structure the world's future. Scott Bessent's most recent public statement has, sent shockwaves through financial markets and stunned even America's closest international partners. In an attempt to apply maximum pressure on Beijing, Bessent has now explicitly linked China's trade relationship with Russia to potential American sanctions. And he's done so with a threat so extreme it borders on economic self-destruction. During a recent interview, Bessent stated, "We are sitting here during a government shutdown when we can't get 7 more Democratic senators across the line. But 85 U.S. senators are willing to give President Trump the authority to put up to 500% tariffs on China for the purchase of Russian oil." 500%. Let that number sink in for a moment. A tariff rate that extreme wouldn't just damage Chinese imports, it would obliterate them. More importantly, it would shatter global supply chains so completely that the American economy would collapse long before China felt the full impact. Financial markets understood this immediately, which is why stocks plunged and volatility indicators spiked within minutes of the statement. The strategic logic behind Bessent's threat is straightforward. Washington wants to strangle Moscow's oil revenue while simultaneously forcing Beijing to choose between access to American markets and energy security through Russian oil. But this strategy is built on assumptions that just don't match reality. First, it assumes China will reduce Russian oil purchases to avoid American tariffs. But that's not happening. In fact, the opposite is occurring. China is currently purchasing approximately 2.2 million barrels of Russian crude oil every single day. That's nearly 40% more than the previous year, making China by far Russia's largest energy customer. And these purchases aren't slowing down, they're accelerating. Here's what makes this particularly significant. Most of these transactions now bypass the US dollar entirely. Payments flow through yuan-based settlement systems or through direct bank-to-bank swaps arranged between Chinese and Russian financial institutions. This infrastructure was built specifically to operate outside the reach of American sanctions and dollar-based payment networks. So threatening China with tariffs over Russian oil purchases misses a fundamental reality. China has already constructed alternative payment systems that make such threats largely irrelevant. The Trump administration also claimed a diplomatic victory with India, stating that New Delhi had agreed to stop purchasing Russian oil. But once again, the actual data contradicts the political narrative. India's Russian oil imports currently run at approximately 1.7 million barrels per day, according to commodity tracking firms like Kepler and major financial news services. That represents a modest decrease from peak levels, but it's nowhere close to stopping. Russian crude now accounts for roughly 35% of India's total oil imports, compared to just 2% before the Ukraine conflict began.